Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this new episode of Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Mr. Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about one of Mr. Rosa's particular specialties, the idea of CBDCs. And just last month, there was a big conference in Amsterdam that you attended, Brunello, and I want to hear all about it. But before we get started, for those in our audience that might not know, what is a CBDC?
Well, CBDCs are potentially a new form of digital money issued by central banks. They would be kind of the digital equivalent of the cash that we have in hands these days. There would be a liability directly of the central bank, so should not be confused with other forms of digital payment or electronic payments that we are doing these days, which are kind of credit cards or similar, because these are not liabilities of the central bank. CBDCs would be a liability of the central bank directly. Potentially, each of us could become kind of a current account holder at the central bank. Probably things will not go that way. Probably there would be commercial banks in between the central bank and us, but ultimately, the claim we have will be towards the central bank.
Very cool. And so it seems like in most countries it's still in sort of developmental or research phases, but there is a particular project you explored, Project New Era. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
Sure. Project New Era is a project in which we are involved as independent advisors from the macroeconomic perspective. The idea would be issuing a stable coin. A stable coin is a form of crypto asset, if you want, backed by real or financial assets. If these were to be held, for example, these assets were to be accounts or deposit at the central bank, this could be considered a form of synthetic CBDC. So effectively, Project New Era aims at issuing what has been labeled digital sterling, which is would be the predecessor, if you want, of what the central bank might be issuing potentially in the second half of this decade. So quite a few years away, which is the reason why we believe the private sector has the duty of pushing the process forward.
And there's quite a few challenges that still sort of stand in the way of this, coming into mainstream adoption. One of the ones that you mentioned is, the sort of reluctance felt by lots of central banks to even engage with the issue. And you cited a sort of key example from the Bank of Australia. Can you tell me a bit more about that one?
Yeah, I mean, central banks have engaged with the issue now quite widely. It's estimated that around 80% of central banks around the world are now experimenting, trying, studying, some of them implementing projects on CBDCs. But when I speak with some of them, you understand that the approach is very cautious. Some of them bluntly ask, why should we issue CBDCs? What is the problem that they are supposed to solve? Don't we have already whatever we need? Don't we have already cash in terms of banknotes and coins? People can make transaction in real time at very cheap price, potentially free if it's a domestic transaction. So what is it that the CBDC would bring to the table? And the Reserve Bank of Australia a couple of years ago effectively said, that there is currently not some public policy case to introduce a CBDC for retail use, because they say there's still strong demand for banknotes of Australian dollars, because the electronic payment system is still very efficient, compared very favorably with others around the world. and is a very costly exercise for which we don't see the benefit. That's their position. Having said that, in the last couple of years, their position has probably evolved a bit to a number of projects that they have been conducting to see whether the CBDC should be introduced at any point in time.
And I think one of the things that makes this even more complicated is that CBDCs are kind of the overlap of lots of different governing authorities. They don't, very comfortably fall into the ambit of just one. And I think that's been particularly exposed in the UK. And then you mentioned this as well when you said there's a gap between how the Treasury and how the Bank of England feels about these sort of new assets. What is that tension over there?
Yeah, like every form of currency, central bank needs to be involved clearly. However, there are a few things that politicians are kind of keen on. And when it's about sovereignty, they're definitely keen on. And sovereignty in most countries is defined or is perceived to be the result of or represented by the currency in circulation, the flag, the national anthem, right? So as soon as people from that environment realizes that you are touching something that is immediately visible, will be in everybody's hands, or digital wallets or mobile phones, as that would be the case, well, you imagine that they want to have their say. In the UK, the central bank has been quite cautious, and that's their role, to be cautious. They have some financial stability concerns, very well understandable. The government has been more proactive and actually decided to make the UK the crypto hub for the world. Perhaps is a bit too ambitious, but to some extent, the Treasury say no, we should proceed towards this adoption of CBDCs and digital assets, and the central bank eventually will have to follow. We'll see how it goes. Clearly, there's a bit of tensions, at least a dialogue between the two sides of the equation. But I think that eventually the CBDC will be adopted, and as I say, it's inevitable. It's something that cannot be avoided, and therefore it's just a question of time.
And with all things that are sort of inevitable, there is a sense of, if it's going to happen anyway, you might as well get on top of that wave first. And that sort of first mover advantage, at least in this context, has really been capitalized on by China.
Yes.
And the People's Bank of China, and they're by far sort of the most further ahead in this race, if you like to call it like that. They issued the ECNY was it the Beijing Winter Olympics, and sort of the mass scale trial of that. But from a geopolitical perspective, Brunello, what is the first mover advantage? What does China stand to gain by being the first one, and what does the West stand to lose?
Well, China has been trying to internationalize the renminbi for quite some time. It's now part of the reserve baskets of many asset managers, but is creeping up quite slowly. They may be able to accelerate this process by issuing CBDCs. And it's not just a question of reserve currency, it's a question of being able to implement and impose their infrastructure to other countries, especially in the emerging markets, especially those in the Belt and Road Initiative, in which they've been offered by China to build infrastructure, not just physical, but also immaterial infrastructure, including the payment system. And once the digital infrastructure for that particular currency is in place, then you understand that you start controlling a lot of the economic and macroeconomic dynamic of that specific place. So is one of the ways in which China can increase its geopolitical influence around the world. And that's why the West needs to realize that, especially now that the world has been polarized, where Russia has joined effectively China in its camp, the West needs to realize that they need to catch up quite fast. China started in 2014. It took 8 years to get there. The West is way back in the process. There are many years of disadvantage that they need to catch up. The EU is in its 2 years investigation phase, and then there's the implementation phase. US, UK are now in different places. So, if you want to accelerate the process freely, there's lots of work to be done now. And just to conclude, perhaps the point is, we used to have pen and paper to write letters. We used to pick up the phone, the landline, to make phone calls. And now we have emails, and now we do video calls. And in a world in which everything has moved from analogic to digital, it's impossible that we continue to respond to the challenges of the world with the paper cash. The cash in the digital era would be a CBDC, as simple as that. That's why I'm saying it's not just a question of, it's not anymore, if you want, a question of if they will happen, but when they will happen, and perhaps how.
No, it's very interesting to think that maybe in 10 years we'll be looking back the way we do right now at, say, a fax machine, thinking about actual paper notes in the same way,
Absolutely.
and why we didn't move along so fast. So definitely sort of one of the more underlying trends that not everyone is paying attention to every day, but will definitely shift the course of monetary and fiscal policy in the most fundamental of ways. So very, very useful to have your thoughts and insight on this, Brunello. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and until next time.